When life gives you lime, make cards? Yes, I use a lot of lines to make my cards. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a quick reminder of what I mean by LIMES. It's an acronym that stands for List, Include, Modify, Exclude, and Spin. And it's a quick little checklist to help you make a card whenever you see something that inspires you. It works really well when you love the look of a card, but you don't want to copy it exactly, or you don't have the same products, or you're trying to resist the lure of all the amazing new stuff in the latest releases. And it also works really well when your inspiration isn't a card, but I'll save that for another day. Today, I'm inspired by Jennifer Engel. Well, she inspires me more than just today, but not too long ago, she made this clean and simple beauty. I have a bit of a split personality when it comes to my card making because I love messy mixed media techniques like ink blending and watercolor powders and gel printing. But I also love clean cards with loads of white space and pops of color, like this one. So let's start analyzing this card. When I'm listing the attributes of an inspiration, I like to break it down into three categories. I start with color. There's red and there's white on this card. The next category is techniques. Jennifer has used die cutting here to cover the full front of her card, and I don't know exactly which die she used, but it looks like it's more than one die. So we could call this a faux cover plate technique. And because it's tone on tone and the butterflies create texture and dimension, we can also call it a faux embossing technique. The final category is elements. This card has multiple butterflies on it. It has a script die cut sentiment with a vellum shadow layer behind it. It's an A2 card with the sentiment in the center, and it's a thank you card. Oh, and we can also make note of elements that are not included in the inspiration. For instance, Jennifer has added no embellishments at all on this card. So now we have all this analysis, we can start thinking about what to include or modify or leave out. I've made several examples so you can see how even a deceptively simple card like this one can inspire a lot of different looks. So when I looked at those butterflies, I saw that they're kind of open, not solid. And while I don't have a lot of butterflies in my stash, I do have this cover plate die from Hero Arts that has a similar look and feel. So with this die, I'm taking that faux cover plate, faux embossing look, and I'm creating something similar. There's lots of little flowers on this, but they all have open centers or petals, and there's lots of space between them. There's even a butterfly or two, and the flowers will give a similar spring kind of feel to my card. Now you don't have to cut down your panel, but I like to make 4¼ inch square cards, so I trimmed mine. And I've got a little too much open space down here in the corner. So I just grabbed the other piece, snipped off a couple of petals, and added them back here. For my sentiment, I don't keep a lot of colored cardstock on hand. I prefer to make my own, and I find that one of the fastest ways to get a lot of color down fast is gel printing. I do have acrylic paints, but they need drying time. So I created some red cardstock with my VersaFine Onyx inks. This is something I've been wanting to try for a while. Catherine Pooler inks work fine on a gel plate, but you need to build up quite a lot of layers to get a really smooth finish. And I wondered if the pigment inks would need the same number of layers or not. Now I'm using pink here because I actually don't have a red pigment ink. So I'm mixing my own. Once I had a couple of layers of pink, I added some purple to kind of deepen it up and give more of a magenta tone. And then finally I added some yellow. This mix gives me a nice cherry red that I really like, and I find it fun to customize my own colors. And of course, you can use colored cardstock for this if you prefer. To reinforce the redness of this panel, I use some Fire Brick Distress Spritz. This also gives a shimmer to the whole panel, and then I added some gold watercolor splatter. To finish the card, I cut a thinking of you sentiment from Concord and Ninth from the red panel, and I used some shimmery vellum to cut the shadow layer. I used liquid glue to attach them together, and then I put the liquid glue on the back of the vellum just behind the letters so it won't be visible. And I used one of the dies from Lots of Dots from Gina K to create some little embellishments, and I put three of them in the centers of the largest flowers. Let's compare. I included red and white, a similar faux embossing technique, a red script die cut sentiment with a vellum shadow. I modified the background to a floral cover plate die rather than butterflies, and I changed the occasion of the card. I don't think I excluded anything, and that's okay. It's just a reminder that you do have the option to exclude any part of your inspiration. And for my spin, which is really just about adding your own little signature touches, my card is a square, and I added 3 homemade embellishments. So this was a great way to get a very similar look to the original without the same products and without it being exactly the same. But what if we make some bigger changes? For this card, I'm starting with a 4-inch square piece of regular vellum, and I embossed it with one of my favorite embossing folders, Dotty circles from Altenew. You don't have to worry about lining this one up at all. This is going to create my embossed background. My first thought was to use this cute little sentiment from Waffle flower. I love that mix of the print and script words, but I have a problem. I need to be able to attach the vellum to the card without the glue showing through. One good solution would have been to use a sticky sheet behind the vellum before I embossed it. That way the glue does still show through, but since it's everywhere, it's not noticeable. My solution here is just to choose a bigger sentiment die cut, so there will be more surface area available for the glue to hold down. And hey, why not add a little butterfly? This one's from a set from Poppy Stamps. I actually went back and punched out those little holes in the wings, and I layered it with a larger white butterfly die cut. This gives a similar loopy look to Jennifer's butterflies and also gives me even more space for the glue to hold the panel to the card. So now how did I do? I included the red and white, die cutting, a dimensional background, and it's still a thank you card. I modified the number and color of butterflies. I reversed the white background in vellum shadow, and I increased the size of the sentiment. And again, I don't think I excluded anything. And my spin is my square card. It's still a similar looking card, but there's some bigger differences than the last one. If you've ever really wanted to get into the nitty gritty of limes and see exactly how I use it, you're in for a treat. On Sunday, January 26th at noon Eastern, at the Create with Your Cardmaking Stash Summit, I'll be doing a live limes demo where the audience will be choosing a card for me to use as my inspiration. You'll get to see how I analyze it and then choose the products I want to use for my stash and then actually make the card from beginning to end, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'll put a link below so you can find out how you can join us. Now let's go further and talk about color. I'm starting with a bunch of snowflake die cuts this time, and I think this is the true similarity to Jennifer's background technique. A bunch of white die cuts on a white background to give a dimensional or embossed look. These ones come from a Jillian Vance design. Next, I'm changing up the color to create a blue sentiment. Now to me, changing colors is the thing that has the biggest visual impact, and it makes the final card look the most different from the inspiration. Let me know if you agree with that. Next, I'm adding that shimmery vellum shadow and the die cut sentiment, very similar to the original. I did make one more change, and that was to add a blue mat around the edges just for a little more definition. So this card has pretty much an identical formula to the inspiration. I've included lots of white with a pop of color. I have multiple die cuts glued onto my background, and I have a colorful die cut sentiment with a vellum shadow. But I changed the butterflies to snowflakes, I changed the thank you theme to Christmas, and I changed the color to blue. I have no butterflies at all. And for my spin, of course it's a square card, and I added that narrow blue mat. Now, do you see what I mean about changing the colors? So here's one of the very few butterfly items I do have in my stash. This is an Elizabeth Crafts butterfly die set. It has a solid full butterfly, then 2 wings, and a body, all separate, which gives you a lot of versatility. This time I'm going to use them all together. So I trimmed off the antenna from the solid butterfly and then the bodies from the separate wings. And this is just so that I'm not trying to line up those fiddly little bits. Also, 3 layers of antenna really are going to be kind of bulky, which is really not what you want in a butterfly. This time I'm using a big vellum circle as my background. And I used some liquid glue to attach my butterfly to that before adding liquid glue to the back of the vellum behind the wings. Now, liquid glue can make vellum wrinkle or buckle a little bit, I noticed. So you may want to either use tape runner or just try to minimize the amount of liquid glue to avoid that. I finished this one with a stamped Altenew sentiment that's reversed. It stamps the solid bar and leaves the words white. I find this kind of stamp so much easier than trying to heat emboss with white. And that's just a lazy card making tip from me to you. Now let's assess. I've got red and white, I have a red sentiment, and I have vellum. My butterfly has open spaces on its wings, but I've changed the number of butterflies and I've changed where the vellum layer is. My sentiment is stamped instead of die cut, and it's white on red instead of red on white. I've changed the theme to thinking of you. My card is a square, and I've introduced that big circle element. So we've talked about some strategies for changing up the inspiration, changing the theme, changing the number of elements, changing the techniques, changing the colors. But so far, these cards are still all pretty recognizable as being inspired by the original. So just quickly, here's a couple more where maybe I took it a little too far. This time, to get that dimensional look on the background, I added some hero paste through the mid-century modern ball and jacks, or is it jacks and balls? Anyway, it's a stencil from a Colorful Life Designs. I'm working with Ranger watercolor cardstock. I'm still pretty new to this paste, but I love the dimension that it adds, and I love how crisp the impression is through the stencil. It dries pretty quickly, so that means you need to get your tools into water right away, but it also means you don't need to wait too long before moving on to the next step. I let this dry for a couple of hours until the paste was matte looking and the panel didn't feel cool. My next step was to add some watercolor powders. These are old Ken Oliver Colorburst powders, and again, I was trying to mix my own version of red with these two. Then I added some pink magicals so that I would get some shimmer on my panel as well, since the Colorbursts don't have shimmer in them. I was hoping for kind of a panel with areas of more orange and more pink, but I added so much water that it all ended up blending into kind of pink, which is pretty, and I'll keep practicing to see if I can get more control with less water. I finished this one with that waffle flower mixed font thank you sentiment from earlier and a matte of the shimmery vellum. If you look closely, you can definitely see the wrinkles there. So this time, I used red and white, although my red is really quite pink. I included a die cut thank you sentiment with a vellum shadow. But this time my colors are reversed. My dimensional background is pink and my sentiment is white. And similar to changing the colors altogether, reversing the colors gives quite a different look. I don't have any butterflies this time, but I do think those funky little X's in the background have kind of a butterfly look. The watercolor powders give a much grungier look for sure. And here's another card where I reverse the colors. Well, kind of. I masked off a strip on my panel with some 1-inch post-it tape, making it as straight as possible by using the grid on my glass mat. I moved it to my turntable to make it easier and more comfortable for me to blend my rouge ink over the rest of the panel. Next, I embossed the panel with the Mod Circles 3D embossing folder from Spellbinders. This one does take a bit of lining up because each row of the pattern is 1 inch wide, so I wanted it sitting right on that white strip of the panel. For my sentiment, I stamped another one of these reverse sentiments from Altenew, using a scrap of white cardstock and the same rouge ink. I trimmed it by hand with my scissors right up to the edge of the red stamping, and then I attached it to a circle of that shimmery vellum. Because the panel is bumpy, I used some foam tape behind the red strip sentiment to pop it up, and then to finish it off, I added some of those red embellishments that I had used earlier. Okay, so it's not easy to see the relationship here, is it? But that red and white color scheme is still a really strong tie between them. I'm sure you're starting to see what I meant when I said that color is the most visual way of being inspired. So let's compare. I've got red and white, I have a dimensional background, and I've kind of got X's again instead of butterflies. My red thank you sentiment has a vellum layer behind it, but it's stamped instead of die cut, and it's on a big white horizontal area, which wasn't included in Jennifer's original at all. Actually, now that I'm looking at this again, I see that if I had done this exact sentiment on a pure white panel embossed with the same embossing folder, it would feel a lot closer to the inspiration. And again, it's a square card and I've added some embellishments. When you're using lines, it's up to you how closely you want to stick to your inspiration or how far out you want to go. Inspiration can be just a starting point or it can be your exact roadmap. It's completely your choice. There's no limes police. The only measure of success is how you feel about your card when it's done. Don't forget to use the link below to find out more about how you can join me at the live Limes demo next Sunday. If you can't join us, or if you're watching after the live event, or you just want to know more, I've also got 2 other ways for you to learn how you can use Limes. First up is this playlist right here. And secondly, each week on my blog, I join an inspiration challenge where I choose a card inspiration and use Limes to make a new card that's inspired, but also totally my own. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.